All right. So this is another.
What do you think about me putting questions in the chat? That way you don't have to lose rhythm. Or would you rather I just take notes?
I would say put them in the Shepherd's Dojo. Because on Zoom,
even better.
On the Zoom chat, it pops up and then it disappears. So it puts a clock on it. But on the dojo, I can go and come and go at my own leisure.
Gotcha.
And you'll generate interest in the lectures themselves because, well, things are being posted about them and discussed. So you'll just have to explain what's going on one time and everyone will get why random questions are just floating into the thing. But it'll also spark discussion for the group as a whole. So there really is no downside. If you ask a question, you'll just get a bunch of answers, me live and them, whoever decides to get to it and when. Yeah, that's a winner, Tony.
Gotcha.
Good deal. All right. So today's episode, lecture, topic, whatever you want to call it. I got distracted. My ADHD got me. There we go. All right. I'm good. Today's topic is, oh, balls. I had it. The nature of how we form reality. Nature of how we form reality. Okay, so that's, well, I could talk about that for 90 minutes. I probably will. Hopefully not too much more, but sometimes it's hard to stop. So the nature of how we form reality. First of all, what the hell does that even mean? So I have to talk about a lot of things. The nature, first of all. So when I talk about nature, I'm talking about behavior. I'm talking about construction. I'm talking about the way a thing is put together and sort of to say the same thing from a different direction is also to say that because a thing is put together a certain way, it becomes a thing. Like it's a defining characteristic that goes in both directions. Like if you could know nothing about a dog and you understood that dog by understanding every atom of that dog, then you would be talking about the exact same thing, even though it would take you 1,000 novels to explain it, as the person who understands the concept of dog as a single creature and then writes 1,000 novels as to how the dog works. So both of those things can reach the same point independent of one another. So that's what I mean when I say nature. Just the way it behaves, the logical construction, the repeatable experiments. There's a good one. Whatever the underlying patterns. So that's what I mean by when I say the nature of the way we form reality. So that's one word I got taken care of. The nature of the way we form reality. So the next one is, the next big word on there is reality. I've seen a lot of fights on the internet about what reality is. And since everybody doesn't see those fights, those realities only exist for a small number of people, and the rest of us don't know about them. At least subjectively, we don't know about them. They become part of our collective ignorance. You know, stuff we don't know, and there's new stuff like that being made every day. There's advances in science. There's crimes that happen that we don't solve. There's things that happen in the world, natural disasters, local disasters, local deeds of heroism. At least a few times a week, a coconut falls on a dude's head. So all of these things become part of the growing, changing, let's just call it collective unknown, meaning there's new stuff that happens that we don't know happens. So it's not enough to say that we can figure out everything that ever is, because everything that ever is always changing. So the only way we would be able to figure out everything that ever is and the way that everything ever would be, number one, to fully understand reality the way that a person who understands the atoms can create the concept of a dog. We would need that. Plus, it would also need to be possible. And what that means is that until we figure out how it works, we don't know that there isn't an element of unpredictability that is, by some mechanism, removed from conscious access. There might be rules to it. There might be a pattern to it. It could be one of those things where it only works if you don't know about it. Like if it's being observed, it doesn't work. There's a lot of things in science that function that way. Like the electron double slit experiment, for example. If you're watching it, it behaves one way. If you're not watching it, it behaves another. And that's crazy.
Repeat the name of that.
The double slit experiment.
The double slit experiment.
Slit, yeah, S-L-I-T. So what that is I'll go over that briefly then because it's a useful concept. So the double slit experiment, and I'll put a correction in there. The double slit experiment is the study of electrons and light waves. And there's some other things that it studies. But basically the way it's looking at is it has a detector that can pick up where a thing lands on it, and it has a wall, a barrier. And then in that barrier, there's a notch cut out so that light can get through. So they shine a light through that one little notch. And when they do that, the detector shows one solid strip of light. And it's bright in the center, and it's kind of dim at the edges. And what that says is that all of those electrons are traveling towards that spot. And most of them are falling in the center. Some of them are falling to the left. Some of them are falling to the right. And it follows a probability distribution that we have math for. It's been called one of the most tested and verified experiments in all of science. So this one is a good one. They've explored it to death because it's weird.
I like things like that. Things that you can really grab onto.
That's right. It's how GPS works. It's how a lot of stuff works. There's a lot of stuff that, yes, it is. But that's the single slit experiment. The double slit experiment is different because when we put the light through one slit, it behaves a certain way. And we say that if we made two slits next to each other, it should behave this way, and it doesn't. What happens is it makes what's called a wave interference pattern, which means instead of a solid band that's got two spots in it, it actually makes stripes that go all along the wall. And so it creates dead zones where some of it has zero and some of it has double what it should. And the reason that happens is because light behaves like waves. Meaning, if you take two waves and one of them's high and one of them's low, for that moment when they meet, they're going to be zero. If you take two waves and they're both high and they meet, in that moment, they're going to be twice as high. If you take two waves and they're both low and both of them meet, they're going to be twice as low. So what we're seeing on the wall with these bands is areas where they're high, both areas where they're opposite, so they cancel, and areas where they're low, so they add. So that's how we found out that light behaves as a particle and a wave. We can shoot one of them and it'll land somewhere. And we can shoot a whole bunch of them, like in a stream of water, and find out that that stream together has a distribution that it follows. So, and that's pretty cool, I guess. And that's kind of, I forgot where I was going. So nature, reality, nature. Reality, yeah. So the point is, when I talk about the word reality, I have to pin that down because right now it can mean anything, which means it means nothing. It's too broad. So when I say the nature of how we form reality, when I say reality, I'm speaking specifically about our individual subjective realities and how they interact with another individual subjective reality. So what that means is, this is why the double slit experiment is important, because I am making the case that reality behaves the same way that light does, meaning that it behaves as both a particle and a wave. Okay? We are the individual particles. We go and we land on our spot on the wall. And some spots are more common than others. It follows a probability distribution, just like everything else that we're born with. You either have a lot of it, the average amount, or very little compared to what most people get. Skills. So reality, I'm saying, follows that same pattern because the subjective realities can exist on their own. That's like firing a photon at the wall and it leaves a mark. And you can measure that. You can correlate that one to one. You can really take your time and say, this electron fired at this time stamp, landed at this coordinate on that wall, and that is finite. Like that is, it's done. Like it happened. It exists. It's an axiom at that point. It's a fact, indisputable fact, because you properly fenced it in. This particle at this time did this thing and went here, and that's all you say. So that's how you can lock in a small truth like that. So imagine that's one reality. Well, now you've got another person. Well, they land somewhere else. And maybe those two people don't even ever interact. You know, they're so far apart, they never touch. One person's over here, one person's over there. Well, that's all fine, but let's say you get two of those that bump into each other. How often do you see this work with reality? So I'm going to make a comparison about behavior and say that behavior can act like these waves. And I'll give a metaphor that makes that gap. So I'm not making a scientific claim here. I'm telling a story to show a pattern. The pattern is what matters, not the story. Please understand that. So say you have a person who is strictly positive, and they meet another person who is strictly positive, and they like each other. Well, guess what? They could team up, and they're going to be twice as strong. And they don't really need to do a whole lot to make themselves similar to each other, because they just happen to be similar to each other. So it's because they're similar to each other that when they meet, their power increases in the positive direction. I'm using positive arbitrarily. It can mean something bad in the positive direction if you wanted to. Now, let's take that example in the other direction. Say you meet two people in a negative direction, and they meet up. Well, they're going to have a lot in common too. And gangs are like this, right? You collect all the people who think a certain way, and as long as it's okay to shoot people, as long as it's okay to run things the way you want, and snitches get stitches, etc., then that's going to be what that reality / behavior becomes. And the more of them there are, the more powerful that becomes. So those stack up. Okay, so now let's give the other example, one where you have one positive and one negative. Well, let's say that they're equal. How many times have you seen a positive and a negative interaction just spin out? Where two people met, they were way different. They didn't know how to do anything except be what they were. And what they were was a thing that didn't change in ways that made it so that when their behaviors collided, they canceled each other out. So one person gets pissed and doesn't accomplish anything. The other person gets pissed and doesn't accomplish anything. So these two things meet. That's done. And you can come up with all sorts of different variations of that. Some people might have a little bit in one direction and a lot of it in another direction. Well, if they interact, what they're going to do is they're going to move in that other direction. And this other person's going to have to move in the direction next to them. So for that brief moment, their average is closer to the guy who had the bigger piece of the pie, but it's less than the total amount because that person has a deficiency that's being absorbed and masked by this. So, or a different way is to say that person has a unique interaction and it does have an impact. It's just not measurable enough to change the direction of a thing. It would only change the amount of it that's there. And if that amount is small enough, it would be difficult to find. So if you begin to think about personalities like that, then different things start to make sense. Meaning that people behave like particles and waves, which goes to Tony's. Tony's a big proponent. A big proponent of vibes, right? Feelings, the energy of a person. So what is he talking about? He's talking about a specific vibration, which is a wave. It's a wave with an amplitude that doesn't change, which is why I'm confusing, because I learned how to change my amplitude. In fact, it's not even that I learned how to change my amplitude. I did, but my original skill was I couldn't keep the same amplitude. And that just happened on its own. And so I eventually switched enough channels and learned enough things to figure out how to build a TV remote. It was just, I couldn't stop the channels from changing, but I could pay attention to what was there enough to help me get control of the situation. And people who have autism, I think, are people who have a hard time locking on to a specific frequency, or certain frequencies to them are painful. And so it's better almost to have the TV on infinite cycle than to have it be stuck on one painful channel, because you might still get painful channels, but they're not constant anymore. And the brain does interesting things when it's in pain. So that's what I mean when I talk about reality. At least the way reality behaves. So reality behaves like waves, meaning you have your set frequency that you're locked into, that's your subjective experience. And you could, if you were exact enough, you could write that down, because you're the only one who decides what that is. That's every person. Like, I can't tell another person what their subjective reality is. And not from their perspective. I can, and anyone can, map the shape of their perspective reality. I can say that here are the boundaries you do not cross, but I can't begin to say why you won't cross those boundaries without direct interaction from you. Like, you would have to give me that information because you invented it. And so that's kind of what I mean when I say subjective reality. It's unique knowledge that only exists inside one specific particle. Now, here's where things can get interesting, is there is a lot of diversity when it comes to frequency and subjective reality and initial starting conditions. But it's not infinite, which is why every once in a while you have a glitch in the matrix and you literally feel like you have met the same person. Two people who have never met each other, who for some reason or another damn near have identical experiences and have figured out the same things. And I can tell you where those people will be, or where you'll be more likely to find them. I'll give you a hint. It's not going to be in the center. The center is average. There's too many. Almost everything goes there. But if something has the smallest of small chances to be at the very edge of a thing, then number one, the thing that is at the very edge of the thing is going to be far less common. Which means if it's less common, that means it has less variety. In fact, it's kind of how you define it. It's at the edge of this thing in the same place. I see your hands up. I'll get to you in just a second. The point is when you go to the edges of an extreme, eventually you're going to reach a limit. And the closer you are to that limit, the closer everything that is next to you will be to that limit. So that's the unifying factors. It's not, you're pushing the boundaries of what's possible by being there at all, at least the current boundaries as we understand them. So that's kind of where those odd similarities can come from. Tony, what's up?
Kind of like before with some other concepts and the flower of life, and when I brought that up before.
Okay.
What do you think about what you're expressing now and the concept of deja vu?
I think that the farther you get in history from a specific instance, the less likely you are to repeat a pattern because, like I said before, new things happen. So in the world, you have something called synchronicity. And that's a fancy word for coincidence. For people who aren't familiar with synchronicity, I'll boil it down to its essence. Synchronicity is when two people or groups or whatever come to the same conclusion or the same thing happens and none of them appear to have anything to do with each other. It just like coordinated coincidence is how people describe the word synchronicity. What that is evidence of is what I've been saying. There are people in the world who are at the edges of a given spectrum. And when that happens, if there is some sort of underlying behavior that describes how we understand the world, and there's a finite number of ways we can tune into that frequency, like our radio tuner has limited bandwidth, then the folks at the very edges of that, even if they're outside of each other's influence, they're not outside of the influence of everything that creates this reality. So they're born in the same soup. And because they're born in the same soup, they reach the same conclusions at about the same speed. But they don't know that other people are doing it. They're just following their nature. Your hands up again, or is it still up?
I need to lower it down, but I just put the definition of synchrony in the dojo.
Okay. Yeah, yep, there you go. So that's kind of where that happens.
Yeah, I was thinking that definition could help anybody watching in the future as well. Like that's a good, clear.
The simultaneous occurrence of events which appear significantly related but have no discernible causal connection. I'm saying they do have a discernible causal connection. The root of synchronicity is the snapshot of the world that interacts with our conscious nature. And that snapshot has enough similarity that when combined with our finite number of combinations of tools we have to pursue what we understand as reality, similar answers are going to pop up. And it'll probably be at the edges of the spectrum for people with intelligence and creativity. Why? Because they're smart enough and creative enough. And all that is really saying is that if you have 1,000 people and one of them is better at solving puzzles than the other, then the one who's better at solving puzzles will solve it first. That's all that's saying. There's no judgment of value or personal worth. It's just Kobe Bryant's going to score more points than I am in a Miami Heat game. Mostly because I'll get one shot before they drag me off the court because I could never make the NBA legitimately. And he's allowed to be there. But that's kind of all I'm saying is that the people who are good at riddles are going to find the answers first when the original snapshot is the same. And the cool thing about the internet is that synchronicity will happen faster because everybody has access to the sum total of human knowledge. And so rather than having different snapshots of reality accessible to different parts of the world, now the entire world has access to the same snapshot of reality. It's a giant mess, and you can find a lot of things on there, but there are certain people who will be driven to look for certain behaviors and will find the same truths hidden in those records of the internet, or come to the same conclusions, same theories, same ideas. And when they start to communicate with each other, those ideas are going to spread. And what that means, when those ideas spread, that updates the snapshot. So normally something like this would take a generation, but now it could take a week before somebody has a really cool idea and they make a meme about it. Well, now that meme actually has some truth in it, so it goes viral. Why does it go viral? Well, because people are interested in it and they don't know why, or it's funny and they don't know why. Well, those are the things that the subconscious is saying we need to focus on. Go to the last lecture. So we copy them, we reproduce them, and we distribute them because we recognize them as valuable on some level. And so every time that new thing pops up, that updates the snapshot of the people who are hyper sensitive to the changes in the snapshot of the world around them. and they get access to that information much faster. And here's the other thing. That's not just a linear process, because learning how to interact with that pattern is a skill, and people spend their lives devoting it. That's your professional students, right? Your seekers, your great philosophers, you know, they spend all their free time thinking about stuff. And if they're lucky, they'll find a few things in their life that update their snapshot of the world and give them more stuff. And as they get older, they get better at doing that. Why? Because they get more practice at it. Okay, so now you have better access to total information, which wasn't available before. You have better access to updates and changes in the information as viewed by like the general population, and a greater ability to practice the skill of doing this. So as this skill is practiced, the skill goes up, the talent of it goes up. Those people now who needed 10 pieces of information to make a good pattern, after doing this a literal 500 times, because they can, it's like a drug to them, and the internet is an infinite landscape of doing this. Well, now after 500 times of doing that, they only need 8 pieces of information. And maybe after a few years, they need 5 pieces of information. And so it's not a linear growth, it's exponential. So that's kind of how changes in the world snapshot happen. So what I would say is that there's a couple of possibilities here, and I'm leaning towards one over the other, and I'll share which one it is. One is the Corkscrew Theory, okay? Some people think that things that change and evolve and update over time follow an ever ascending corkscrew. That's the God without limit theory. That's the theory that God is not a creature who is unchanging and therefore perfect. It is the argument that God is perfect and therefore able to create new ways to better himself that didn't exist before. The argument being a very simple one: what is more perfect, a being which can improve itself or a being that is not able to improve itself? Because if both beings are equal, which you can do that hypothetically regardless of the power level, one has one ability and the other does not, well, it seems like an easy comparison to say the thing that can make itself better or more would be superior to the thing which is unable to do that. So that's the one theory, is that reality can just kind of build and build and build, and it's going to go who knows where. And the reason for that being that people invent a lot of this stuff. So we can invent stuff that doesn't exist in the universe. That's what makes that possible. Is if we could only invent things that we'd seen or interacted with, or like we couldn't invent, we could only borrow. Okay? What that would give us is access to an infinite Lego set that, if we collected all the pieces, would build the universe. But we can invent pieces that don't exist with imagination. And because our realities are subjective, we can believe whatever we want to believe. And the next part of this lecture is actually going to talk about why that's necessary and how it would be very bad if that wasn't the case in a lot of ways. All right. So it took me half an hour to explain what I mean by the phrase "the nature of reality." I think it was worth it, because what you can do with that specific perspective is actually pretty cool. So now we're going to shift gears, and when I talk about the nature of how we form reality, we're going to switch from the nature of reality and use that word for one of its double meanings, which is nature, meaning our nature now, meaning how do human beings form reality subjectively. So now I'm leaving the macroscopic scale of all reality, And I'm talking about that which is specific to the subjective reality only. And I can do this because nothing that is specific about the nature of subjective reality goes outside the bounds of what is the nature of all reality creation, as different people do it. So it presents differently, but it uses the same mechanics. So I can describe the mechanics, and as long as I leave the variables unfilled, I'm speaking of a specific thing that can apply to each individual point. All right. So why do people need reality? Well, it's a good question. One of the reasons that we need a reality is because it's how we survive. I'm not saying it's the only way to survive. I'm saying it's how we survive. We live in a physical universe, all right? There's things that happen. Meteors fall, and tidal waves happen, and earthquakes happen. Sometimes it gets too hot, and your body needs food, and you need to drink water, and sometimes you get sick, and you have to sleep and shelter. So these are things that happen, whether we choose them or not. All right. So these things have always been. Every human who's been alive has had to deal with these problems. And the reason that makes reality essential to the survival of everything that's alive is if you get it wrong, you die. Like you get some wiggle room. But if you go bad enough in any direction, you die. So the fact that we're still here means that enough of us were able to learn enough, stay alive long enough to make more of us. Which, if you're thinking about our survival as a species, well, that's good. And if you think about consciousness as an organism, the survival of consciousness itself actually depends on that. And if consciousness can elevate itself over time by updating the snapshot over generations, which is what people refer to as genetic memory, I think that's stored behaviorally. That's Jordan Peterson theory, meaning we're born into a world with so many rules that exist for no reason other than people always do them. And there's wisdom locked into that behavior that we don't understand as wisdom because it's so mundane, right? Like, I'm trying to think of the simplest of examples, like a modern person who has lived well, not in a first world country. Let's use that as an example because that's where we're farthest removed from a lower state of living, right? So it'll show contrast. So first world country versus pooping in a cave. Well, first world country people, especially younger ones who really don't think about it too much, don't understand a world without running water. I need water. Go to the faucet. Okay, my faucet's broken. Okay, go to the neighbor's. Oh, okay, fine, done. Or the water's out for the neighborhood. Go to the store, buy some bottled water. Okay, water used to be a very big deal. Wars were fought over water. The aqueducts and the hanging gardens were modern marvels of their time and gave tremendous advantage to the people who had them. Running water. And now we're pissed off if we don't have it for more than a day. And we make an angry phone call if we have to spend $20 on bottled water because ours was out. Now you need to give me a credit off my bill right now. This is your fault for that pipe. When a couple hundred years ago, that didn't exist. So the behavior that is baked into having access to that water becomes integrated into the snapshot that is just accepted. And that is where you have your genetic memory. Things that were made before you that give tangible benefits, which are stable enough to span the bridge of time. Okay? You can benefit from roads that were built before you were born, both physically, literally, and figuratively. So that is the mechanism of how consciousness improves itself over time is it can leave things behind. Why do you think people like to create so much? That's reproduction of consciousness right there. Why do you think most of it sucks? Well, because mutation usually dies. And what do you get when you throw shit against the wall and see what sticks by taking every possible combination of human perception and throwing it at the snapshot of the world as it is right there? Well, you get a lot of shit and some stuff that's good. You get spots on the wall that are dark. You get spots on the wall that are light. That's what happens. So that is how consciousness can grow itself across generations invisibly. And that works great, unless you have like mass extinction level events. That sets the population back. You know, you lose a bunch of people. Well, what happens? You lose a big chunk of that spectrum. Well, what happens then? Well, all that behavior goes away. And all of those things that were tied to those people go away, and everybody else who doesn't have them has to learn how to adapt. In America, we're facing a labor shortage right now. Why? Well, there's a lot of reasons. Well, does that make all of those reasons not valid? No, that there's a lot of reasons is number one a problem. That's evidence of something that's larger. But the result of it is there are jobs that are not filled, and services are suffering at every level. Shipping, receiving, transportation, manufacture, production. The only thing that's up is consumption. Production is down. So I would say why? And people will say, oh, it's because of COVID, and it's because of this, and it's because of this, and it's because of this. And what would be the root cause of that? Less people can be productive while that's happening. That's all I'm saying. The level of hardship that it takes to paralyze a population is presenting itself in our history right now. We had World War II, motherfuckers. Like, those guys took a big hit. And following that big hit, we had a great period of productivity, at least objectively speaking. You measure this, you measure that, you measure science, technology. A lot of things went in a direction that people would say is good for a lot of reasons. But that happened. So there was this period of incredible struggle. And one of two things happened, and probably both of them happened. Number one, you had a large interaction with a snapshot that was highly negative, and I am using negative in the sense of negative this time. You had people confronted with the consequences of bad choices. And I know I'm oversimplifying by calling Nazi Germany a bad choice. And there's people who would write books about how bad of a choice it was, and there have been. And I would say, don't limit your study of bad things that happened to Nazi Germany. Also go into, read the Gulag Archipelago, which is the story of how very similar things happened in Russia, except the only difference was on the Germans, you had a conservative push that led to this extreme tyranny and murder of lots of people. And in Russia, you had a liberal approach that led to extreme tyranny and the extermination of a lot of people. And the point is that both of these extreme pushes ended badly. And you had large numbers of troops going to places where this was happening. So large numbers of people were updating their world snapshot, number one. Number two, interaction with a force like that, such a drastic change. Meaning it's not like their snapshot got updated a little bit. It's not like a new car model came out. Or, you know, now you have a microwave that can cook your food in 5 minutes instead of 8 minutes, because that was the big rage at the time. Like, microwaves took almost longer than the oven, but they got better. And you bought the new microwave and everybody was happy. And now microwaves don't matter and they cost $60 at Walmart. And nobody cares because everybody has a microwave. But, oh, my microwave's broken. Go use the neighbors. Same as water. That's a running, it's not a running gag or a bit, it's just running, like the water. All right, so that's my point for, so when you get to World War II, you have this giant change. So all of these people who had this one amplitude, right? Well, guess what? They are nowhere near in big as magnitude as World War II and the horrors of that. So you have a large collection of the world that all interacts with this giant thing, and everybody shifts because it's bigger than all of them. So it moves the whole thing violently. And a lot of people die whenever that happens. That's number one. That's the scientific wave explanation of this. And I'm going to give an explanation.
Wait. It sounded like a conclusion statement when you said, whenever that happens, a lot of people die. But I feel like a lot of people dying is the catalyst for the, yeah, exactly. There you go.
So it's not a start and end, it's a cycle.
Yep, and just wanted to double check. I wasn't correcting or nothing. I just wanted to make sure we were on the same vibe.
Well, here's the other part that kind of reinforces that as well. This is the other thing, the thing that you wouldn't be able to say on CNN because I don't know why, but I'm going to say it. When a lot of people die, it's usually the dumb ones that die the most. When you're talking about a life and death survival situation where thinking quickly will save your life, okay? You have a large collection of people sent to impossible situations. The dumbest ones are going to die in larger percentages than the smarter ones. So not only did you have a high interaction with a world-shaping event, but there was also a mass culling of the dumbest people who might be trying to pull things in a direction that doesn't make sense. So those two things working together, what happens? Everybody goes home. It's quiet for a while. Peace, prosperity, or at least prosperity, manufacture, et cetera, et cetera. Well, now what? Well, people haven't had a good fight in a while. Not in the sense of, at least I'm talking about America. I'm talking about America. I don't know about other countries. There's other countries where, and I can actually say this more pointedly. There are other countries right now that when those people come to America, they will kick the ass of any American in terms of their ability to succeed. And that is because it is much harder for them to succeed where they are, because the fight for survival is much tougher there. They have to learn different lessons. They have to get there faster. And what that means is that part of the world, their snapshot is full of people who remember how to do that already. So they pass it on. Right? Father to son. Okay, kid, here's what you got to know. Here's what they're going to tell you. Here's what you really need to know. Here's the stuff they don't tell you. That's the stuff that gets passed on in harsher situations. When everybody succeeds without trying, nobody cares to pass on valuable information because there's too many paths to victory. It's a waste of time, or at least it looks like a waste of time. Feels like a waste of time to the person doing it, which is why they don't. Which is why it doesn't get done, which is why over time it builds a weak population. And when I say weak, I mean weak in terms of their ability to overcome adversity. That skill atrophies because of an abundance of prosperity. And so what happens is, as that skill atrophies, there's going to be a while where nobody notices. Kind of like not going to the gym for a couple of weeks after you've been going for a couple of years. You know, you might go back and feel a little stiff, but you're not really going to lose anything. You can jump right back into it. And maybe even 2 years later, you know, you're still in good health. You go back, and boy, man, you're sore for a couple of days. But then what? About a week in, you're back into it. You never felt like you were gone. Well, what about 20 years? Well, now you're 20 years older, number one. And if you were 40 the last time you got in shape and you didn't do anything for 20 years, you're 60 now. Even if you were 40 and you hadn't exercised for 20 years, you would have been significantly weaker then. Add to that 20 years of the aging process in the direction that's towards life expectancy at that point. You're 60 years old, you better be thinking about what you're going to do with your time. You don't have a lot of it left. And if you didn't do anything with it leading up to that, you've got a lot more to do. If you have things left undone and less time to get it done in, at least on average, So my point is, when there's an abundance of prosperity, it becomes very easy to avoid adversity. And when you avoid adversity over time, your ability to overcome adversity is challenged. You forget how. You forget how to overcome adversity without creating it. That's a skill right there. That's what people try to do right now. That's, to be fair, that's what a lot of people try to do most of the time, is they'll overcome adversity by punching it in the face. And in certain situations, that reaction is good for them and bad for someone else. Okay, they don't create prosperity, they take it. You've got that thing. I'm strong enough to take it, so I will. Problem solved. But now that other person has adversity. Why? Because you just took their shit. Now they don't have it. So that person now has to go through adversity. And when that happens on a large scale and people aren't good at it, they're going to crumble. But then what happens? The people on the extremes, they go through that same adversity and they break down the pattern of how and why it happened. They analyze what was done to them and learn how to do it better. And then they become the creator of adversity because now they're better at taking prosperity. And they do. And if that goes on long enough, the adversity builds and slowly creates a population which is capable of doing more, better, stronger, faster, smarter. The tolerance goes up. It's one reason why 50 years ago you were allowed to make racist jokes. And I don't mean allowed in the sense that it was right or wrong to look down at a person for how they were. I meant that nobody gave a shit because they had just been through World War II. And it was words compared to mustard gas and gas chambers and Nazis and barbed wire and Sherman tanks and the atom bomb. You think someone cares about the N-word if they've seen a guy get stabbed in the kidney while they're holding their intestines in, waiting for the medic chopper? Don't give a shit about that. That's the point, is that's why that stuff took so long to fix. There's bad sides to that too. There's bad sides to being able to extremely overcome adversity is you don't have a lot of sympathy for people who can't. Even though they might not have the same starting pieces. You're going to be like, well, shit, I overcame adversity. I didn't have it easy. Do you know how much more adversity it would create for me to fix your adversity on top of mine? And I'm going to make you weaker in the process, which means I'll have to do even more later because you can do less. It's not a good choice, at least from that perspective. Well, you're going to be the dad that gives up his Sunday afternoon watching football because you did a stupid thing and you need to be taken out to the woods and taught a lesson with a switch that you pick yourself, followed by a heart-to-heart conversation so that never happens again, followed by a fishing trip where you guys bond and love each other, and then you come home and you never do that shit again because you could have died or hurt somebody or caused some real problems. That's when that goes right. That's when the responsible adult who's seen some shit steps in and creates some shit that you can handle just enough to scare the shit out of you to realizing what happens if you become weak against adversity. That's how that cycle happens. And right now, we're at the part of the cycle where we're running out of abilities to make the world weaker for us. And people, they've hit a critical limit. They're just going to start collapsing. And that's the bottom of the cycle, and it heads back up from there, like I just described. So that's kind of the overall cycle. So now let's go down into the subjective version, why we form reality. So that's how reality happens around us. That's how it changes, that's how it grows. That's how we interact with it. So how does it form? Well, now we're getting to like the very subjective part of this, right? It forms when our consciousness, as described in our other lectures, which I'm not going to go into because it'll take an hour, interacts with our senses. And our senses are actually part of our consciousness. At least for now they are. Our consciousness would change if they went away. And in some people, they do go away, which does change their consciousness and gives them cool, different perspectives. So our senses give us information, and it's limited. This thing does that. This thing falls when I drop it. That person is allergic to peanut butter. Little bits of information. That bird makes this noise, and that other bird makes this noise, and that third bird makes this noise. That's all information that we get. So we are bombarded with a lot of stuff. And the brain sees it all. The subconscious remembers it all. The body feels it all. But we can't handle all of that information at the same time. Too much. Especially the way we react to changes in our environment and the overloads of things that we can't handle. That makes us have anxiety. And when we have anxiety, our brain actually shuts down the parts of us or limits the parts of us that are capable of reasoning more. Why? Because if your reasoning got you in trouble, it stands to reason by the body's limited brain that if I get rid of my ability to reason, I'll get rid of my ability to be in this state. It's great if you're having a single moment where you just need to chill the fuck out. Not so great if you're trapped in a cycle where if you could only reason better what was going on, you'd be able to get yourself out of it. That's why the parents need to step in sometimes and beat some shit into you, either with their words or their actions, or preferably, in my opinion, a lot of the first and just enough of the second to get your attention so it doesn't have to happen again. And I think it works best with both, because you will never create a person who does not respect why violence is bad if they have not experienced it in some setting on their own. Meaning, if you don't ever hurt, you won't know what it means to hurt another person. And that includes if you beat the shit out of them. Might even feel good.
Isn't that
possible? I mean that
you just lost me.
What I mean is that if you have never been hurt in your life physically, you won't understand what it means if you do it to someone else. And
But hasn't everybody?
I would say some people have been more than others. I've never had the shit kicked out of me. So
I would definitely say some have more than others, but I feel like you were on this great freight train and it just took a hard L when it was you won't understand this unless you've been through this, because even within the nature of reality,
all that is saying you haven't had a subjective experience that someone else has. So you can hypothesize the shape of that subjective experience, but you can't have the same experience they did. And even if
that's a better vibe for me. I like that.
There you go. And I'll build on that because that's a good point. Even if you did have the same access to the same information, your distribution of senses is not identical. So you would interpret that same input in that same spatial reference in a different way just because your machinery is different. So you'd live through it and you'd remember it differently. You might understand enough of it that you could take a core message that you could explain to someone else, but no two beatings are ever the same. Even the same beating, as long as different people are involved. So my point though is that if you have never hurt because someone else hurt you, you won't understand why that's a bad choice. And that doesn't mean that this needs to be a daily reminder, because that's how bad parents do this. The best parents all tell the same story. And that story goes like this. And I got both stories, by the way. I had a parent who did this wrong, and I had a parent who did this the way that good parents tell this story. A good parent will spank their kids until they don't have to anymore. And that's their goal. And there's ways to do this intelligently, and there's ways to do this that won't work. So some parents, they discipline their kids, but they do it wrong and they hit them. And it doesn't change anything because they're not doing everything right. They don't care enough. They're not giving the right message. They're just using the violence when it's appropriate, but they're not using it in a way that will make it end. And that needs to be the goal of a good parent, which is what good parents have in common. They all tell the same story. And that story is, yep, I've only really had to put my kid over my knee a couple times. And they'll tell some stories about when and why. And you'll listen to those stories and you'll be glad nobody died. You'll be glad nobody went to prison. You'll be glad someone didn't ruin their life. And the parent will make an exception to their own general rule of we can talk this out and say some things need to be reinforced in a way that will last. And they put the kid over their knee. But what happens? Those are the good parents, remember. So they're thinking about a lot of things. The first thing they're thinking is they hate this. That's a good parent. A good parent will do a thing they hate if it's the right thing. A bad parent will not do a thing they hate, even if it's the right thing, because they'll be thinking about themselves. So we're still talking about the good parents who are doing a thing they hate. They're going to care about how hard they hit their kid. They're not going to do permanent damage. They're not going to leave bruises. They're going to hit in places that will sting more than places that will injure. Like they're not going to take their knuckle and hit you right in the kidney. They're going to take an open hand. And why do people get spanked on the ass? It's because it's the biggest spot of skin on the body that you can put a smack to, outside of like the stomach, but you wouldn't want to do that because that's where all the internal organs live. So good parents are like, no, I don't want to hit you in your intestines or something or puncture your appendix. No, I'm going to smack your ass because it's going to hurt and it's not going to leave anything. So that parent is thinking about all of this and they do it. And what happens? The kid cries. Why? Because it hurts. We cry when we hurt. Okay, that makes sense. So the kid is crying. Well, remember, these are the good parents. These parents care that their kid is in pain. These parents also don't like that they're the ones that caused it, but they understand that it was necessary. So they're at the moment where the pain exists. Now they're going to do the thing that they thought was necessary in the first place, which is give this kid a real dose of reality about the story that whatever story goes with this, the thing that could have got people killed, the thing that could have put them in jail, the thing that could have ruined someone else's life, the thing that they didn't think was important that actually was deadly important. And they're going to put that lesson there. And because there's pain, there's going to be memory, whether you like it or not. That's how it works. And then what? Well, these are still the good parents, remember. So the good parents, and this is all the same story, by the way. They all tell the same story. I said that. So you can't pick and choose the parts of the story you don't like and still call these people good parents, because I'm only talking about the good parents. The right way this happens. It's a necessary ingredient, but it's not the only ingredient. But if you leave this ingredient out, that's not good parenting. That's easy parenting. And if you put this ingredient in and you don't figure out how to make it work correctly by adding the other ingredients, that's not easy parenting. That's not good parenting. That's easy parenting. They sit the kid down and have a heart-to-heart about the kid in general. And they tell the kid, you know, hey, I did this thing, and here's why. And I want you to know I still care about you. This is not a reflection of our relationship. This is actually evidence that I care about you more than I care about what I hated doing, and here's why I did it. And I would rather have you be mad at me now if that trade meant that I knew you would never do this again. And that's parents, that's all they can do, right? The kid's still on his own as far as if that's going to work or not, right? The kid has responsibility and more responsibility as they figure out more about who they are. But that's what good parents do when it comes to that type of punishment. So when I talk about people don't understand pain unless they've had it, it's not a put down. That's not a moral judgment. And it's certainly not a repeating state of mind, which is where I see that argument be bastardized and abused by people who are hurt, people who want other people to hurt. It's not enough that the person experiences it once. No. I had to experience it for 10 years, so you have to experience it for 10 years. That's the reasoning. That's where it goes bad. A person can experience it once and understand it enough to know it's bad. And that's the goal of a good parent. A bad parent just punishes. They don't explain. They don't do anything. They just want the behavior to go the way they want, the reasons they think are good reasons. And they use physical intimidation, which is the other cycle that I told you about. you have prosperity and I can take it because I'm bigger than you. And now your way will be my way or else. I'm a good parent. So all of that. Now, the subjective nature of why we create reality. So we create reality because we die if we don't. That's the first easiest answer. It's not even a why though. That's just an is, right? So I don't really know much beyond that. So we have to kind of start at that point. We create reality because we die if we don't. So it's an initial condition of this. We create a subjective reality is an axiom, which means there's limits to it, as discussed in one of our other videos. But until someone comes up with a better explanation, we have to work with what we can create. So the creation is we create a subjective reality that behaves like a particle in a way which describes the sum total of human experience in my imagination, which is a pretty damn big snapshot. I don't want to minimize the scope of this snapshot just because I admit that it's limited. It's big enough to help a lot. That's why it's important for me anyways. So we create a subjective reality. Here's what happens when we do that. We view the world and we have to make decisions. And we don't know what the right information is. So we do the best we can. And different people come up with different decisions. And now we have this collection of decisions, which becomes our memory. We remember what we did, what we thought, and how it turned out. If we're blessed with creativity or luck or intelligence or a combination of all three, we can do stuff with that to change our patterns. If we can't recognize our patterns enough to change them, we live them. That's free will. You can only change the patterns you see. Every pattern you do not see, you are a part of. That's how it is. So that's why some folks can read other people like a book, and those same folks can't read other people like a book. Or you've heard the phrase a different way. That guy's got his number. You see that in sports, right? Like this one guy kicks everybody's ass. This other guy isn't really that great, but for some damn reason, every time this guy who doesn't really do that good meets this one guy who kicks everybody's ass, he wins every time. What do they say in sports? He's just got his number. Okay. So what that means is there's this weird interaction with how they both understand reality. And this person's understanding of reality just encompasses the other person's so completely that they can see the ins, they can see the outs. Nothing happens inside that bubble that they haven't had a shape of. And maybe they have enough of the same tools that they even have a similar subjective experience. So that is how they do that. That's one way that can happen. So we have these collection of subjective experiences. And one of the things that happens with that is we recognize they're subjective instinctively. And it's actually one of the most fundamental human behaviors there is socially, which is, well, I'm going to talk about validation. Okay, we'll talk about validation as proof of subjective reality being created, and that it is subjective by nature, and that the people who create it know that it's imaginary or incomplete on some level. All of these three things come from this single point, how this interacts. So validation, I have to define that word first before I do anything. So in the most simple terms, validation is another person saying you are correct. Okay. And I'm going to actually narrow that definition down. Validation is saying something is correct with enough authority that that response is satisfactory. And that's a subjective satisfaction. So different people will be satisfied by different things. But if satisfaction is reached because something has said this is correct, that is validation. So it's okay. I'm fine. We're cool. It's all good. That's validation. Validation is I agree with what I see. enough that I can move on from it and be satisfied that if I look away, it's not going to change. That's an important part of validation. Stability. So validation creates stability. A different type of validation would be scientific experiments. If you do a thing once, it's not an experiment, it's a test. You do a thing 500 times, and you do it exactly the same way, and all 500 times exactly the same thing happens, that's validation. It's stability. You can trust it. So people have subjective requirements for validation. And so when I talk about validation and reality, those two things are the same, are linked, okay? A person's need for validation is how stable their frequency is in terms of how they interact with the world. Let's call the subjective reality frequencies. Everybody has a different one slightly. Some of them are very close. So if one person interacts with a frequency and it destabilizes them a lot, they're going to care more about validation if it knocks them out of their state, if their signal strength is weak and it's easily scattered. They're going to want a lot of validation because that's what gives their frequency stability. If somebody is very difficult but knocked out of their frequency, we could say that they require little validation, but that's not correct. Everything requires validation for reality. Reality is validation. That's my point. Reality is a type of validation. So it's the validation you accept for whatever reason. It's valid to you. So what I mean by that is some people cannot produce their own stability. Why? Because they're a different distribution of skills, perceptions, and experiences interacting with the world snapshot. It's a complicated picture, but the end result is mappable. Some people have a harder time producing their own validation. True. You can go on the internet and see one word in two wildly different interactions, and that word is no. Or if you want to really be mean, I disagree. Or if you really want to twist the knife, I don't think that's right. And you'll see some people say, that's okay, I can see your point. And you'll have some people type 10 paragraphs of how evil you are and how wrong you are. And what are they doing? They are throwing everything they can to buttress, I love using that word properly in context, to buttress up their crumbling reality, which has just been destabilized by your 4-word remark. Why?
That's a propping up, right? Because a buttress
Yes,
is a foundational element of architecture.
You got it. Yep, it's like a jack for houses or caves. A buttress. Usually they don't move. The cartoons where they have the wooden beams above the walls.
I didn't know they moved at all. What do you mean usually? I didn't know they were able to.
It's like you can make a buttress out of something that can move, like a jack or actually this. Believe it or not, how did I know? This is a type of buttress. It's an extendable shower rod. So I can.
That's a stripper pole, and you know it.
So I can lock this in place, and it becomes a buttress. But a board would be the same thing if it was holding something up. Anyways, so what they're doing is your 4 words have destabilized their reality to the point where they need to fix it because of our initial condition. Why? Reality is not optional. You need one. And if you don't have a replacement reality for the one that is crumbling, well, you got to do the best you can with the one you have and try to fix it somehow. And people do that all the time. You see duct tape and bubble gum and imagination and prayer and therapy and pills and sex and drugs and violence and anything you can think of, people will toss in there. And they might not know what's happening. There are elements of each of those things that actually help them validate things that are happening. All forms of entertainment create a variety of narrative, which is how consciousness consumes new ideas it can understand because it relates them to you in a language you can understand, which is metaphor. Or recreational substances. They give your brain different chemicals, so they change your machine so that it can interpret reality differently, which gives you an alternate point of view that is inside of you and is subjective, which you were not willing to accept from the outside. Or physical activities like sex and working out and all this other stuff. They activate different parts of the brain. And so you provide yourself different brain chemistry to interact with the same snapshot of reality using different tools, which can develop over time. And that is how people will shore up their realities. Well, so you get into that. So all of that is what happens. So what does all that have in common? So now we're getting down into the basement here of the nature of how reality is formed. All right. We're going to go straight back to my best friend, the amygdala. Fight or flight, survival mechanisms, pattern recognition. That last episode was consciousness. It's the language of the subconscious. So all of the language of the subconscious, your memory and how that makes you feel, and your gut brain, which is your body's warning systems and your emotional control centers. That's what powers your reality. So I'm going to simplify here just so I don't run out of time, which is your emotions power your reality, your logic builds it. Okay. And as we covered in a different episode, logic and emotion are the same thing. So if your logic is weak and your emotion is strong, guess what? Your reality is going to be unbalanced. You're going to see too much emotion and not enough logic. You're going to see too much stimuli and not enough explanation. And if your logic is strong and your emotion is weak, you're going to see too much pattern and not enough reason. Too much happenstance, not enough motivation. You'll understand the what, but you won't understand the why because you don't have a subjective experience of it. The ending result, you create a subjective reality. So everybody whose logic and emotions are not equally matched is living in an unbalanced world where one of their abilities to interact with it is getting more say than is relevant to the total of the information they have access to. So they're paying more attention to some of their senses than others and giving them preferential treatment. That's one of the ways that this happens. But the power of your reality, that is your emotions. Because we talked about this at the very, very beginning. Reality exists because we believe it does. And we have to be the one that decides what it is. And there's factors that can influence that into common paths. But at the end of the day, our subjective reality is only as strong as we believe it is. And you can see this because some people whose subjective realities are bigger for whatever reason, maybe they've been alive longer is a good explanation. They're 80 years old and they've absorbed enough other points of view that someone who's been alive for 20 years might know a lot, but they just can't compete because they haven't had the extra 60 years of experience. That older person could go into that younger person's reality and interact with it in ways that change how it acts, for good or bad. The evil people, they convince people it's a good idea to hurt other people for the greater good. That's one way that that's abused. You'll be a hero. You'll be a freedom fighter. You'll be a revolutionary. Stick it to the man. Fuck them. Let's burn them all and let God sort them out. You'll be a hero. You're doing the right thing. Okay, that's the language of the tyrant who is manipulating someone's subjective reality on purpose. Then let's talk about it the other. So what they're doing is they're aiming someone's reality. So that those mechanisms aim reality. That's a different weaponization of validation, right? They give them reasons, things that explain things in their reality that they don't understand. Why do I feel this way? And if they have no fucking clue, and you come to them with an answer that makes enough sense, and you tie to it something else that makes a little sense but is wrong, like you feel that way because you're a victim. And here's what you need to do. The validation comes with a price. Validation always comes with a price. And if you don't feel like you're paying anything, you're being taken for a ride. And it's a ride that is so well designed, you will come back and tell your friends to come ride it too. It is a machine built to drive you where you think you want to go because it has told you where you want to go in words that make you believe it. And that is because certain top-down views of consciousness and human behavior reveal patterns like this. The hyper pattern recognizing people or the hyper emotionally aware people, they still can be in it for themselves.
That sounds like marketing to me.
That's the I want to sell products side of this. Yeah. The I want to help people side of this is therapy. The I want to motivate people side of this is motivational speaking.
Marketing as a topic, not with a specific subject though. Like marketing itself is oftentimes filling or creating, desire or filling, those cracks or telling people what they, there you go, telling people what they want. That's how I see marketing as a businessman.
Yeah, that is exactly right. And if you're smart enough, you can create a thing people didn't know they wanted. And then guess what? Not only have you created a thing they didn't know they wanted, which they now want, you're the only one who has it. That's called first finder's advantage. But business-wise, you see that go certain ways. Like, I think the worst evil that can cause, at least from a marketing perspective, is you can buy a bad product. On a social side of that, you can create people who want to commit genocide. Child soldiers, right? Or riots because the wrong person gave a speech. Or worse, riots because the wrong person might give a speech. Preemptive rioting. That's not a good use of humanity because it teaches people things that will destroy them, destabilize them. Because there's a cost to that validation, right? You have now been given value and you had to do a thing to get it. So guess what? That's a dependency. The first hit's free. Oh, you won't get hooked. You don't really need it. Quit anytime. But you're a bad person if you voted for Trump. And the minute, or Hillary, I'm not throwing stones in one direction, but the Trump hate seems to be lasting longer than the Hillary hate. Most Republicans don't give a shit about her anymore. People still talking about Trump, who's been out of office for 4 years, going on 5. But the point is, the minute you step out of line, that thing that you need, that you were given, is taken. And because you built parts of your reality on it, that you did not build yourself, you no longer have access to them. And what does that feel like? That feels like a part of you just died. Because guess what? Human beings are sensitive to loss. Even when they lose something they didn't know they had. They didn't know why they had it. They don't know how they had it. They know they have it. Once it's taken away, they can feel it's gone. And so all of a sudden, you start to hear people who would be perfectly calm and rational. And I'm going to use Trump because I like that he twists the nipples just a little bit harder than anyone else. That makes him a good example for this. Trump had a lot of good points. And he was an idiot in some ways. A lot of ways, depending on who you ask. But you will have perfectly rational people, intelligent people, who could understand the ins and outs of those positions and would agree with them fully that some of these ideas are in fact better than what we are doing now, and we would be fools to not implement them. And they will be the ones to say, I really don't want to cause any problems with my circle of friends or my family. So I'm just going to ignore all those good ideas because I wouldn't want to, it's not worth it in the long run. So even the best and the brightest of people who have gone through this, who have in some way, shape, or form surrounded themselves with things. So maybe you produce your own validation, but your entire family does not. So now what? You think it's a good idea, they don't. Are you all of a sudden going to turn your entire family against you when it's obvious that they're being irrational to the point of they will not entertain and they will cut you from your life if you try to entertain? You're going to do the thing which most people would do and say, I'm going to leave this one be. It's not worth it. And you might be right subjectively. You're probably right subjectively. That's the better move for you. But what have you done? Now your subjective reality has gotten smaller by your own choice for reasons that have to do strictly with validation. Because part of your validation, most of it is produced by you, but maybe some of it isn't. And maybe not all of it should be. But knowing how it works and agreeing that it should work that way are very different things. We want our families to love us. I think I could say that. And if they don't love us, it fucks us up in ways that are hard to figure out for a long time. And so that's kind of what I mean when I say that your subjective reality is so closely tied to validation, because if you don't know your reality is real enough to behave like it's true, you won't be able to behave like it's true. And you won't know whether it's a good idea to cross the street or not based on what traffic looks like. You can't make a decision. So the emotions is the power behind the validation. The emotion is what solidifies reality. So if somebody is emotionally unstable, their reality is going to be unstable. And if somebody is logically unstable, their reality is going to be unstable. And guess what? If their reality is unstable logically, they might not be able to sense the emotional instability that creates, but that does create emotional instability and is actually a reflection of emotional instability. It's just a different type of emotional instability. It's a disgust with logic. That's an emotional instability. Highly emotional people are not logical. They're highly emotional when it comes to the topic of logic, which is a different type of emotion. No, I'm disgusted by that. Stop talking. Why are you analyzing me? That's what you hear. How dare you think you could know that? Well, I think this and I think, no, stop it right now. You can't know. What is that? That's not logic. It's more than emotion. It's a disgust with logic. And if you're blind to that, well, knowing people who aren't at least somewhat logical is a bad thing, because they're going to fuck with your lives in ways you can't predict. And some of those people die. You got to remember that. Whenever you interact with the world, some of those people are doing it so wrong that they're not going to be alive much longer. And some of those people are doing it so wrong that living their life would be worse than suicide. And I want to live in a world where that's as rare and as specifically chosen by the person chasing it as possible. Like, if somebody goes there, I want it to be because they really wanted to go there, and not because everything around them made it so much easier to go there. That's the right way to accept that that's a truth. Is some people are going to do it no matter what you do, and there are things you can do to change the game enough so that that choice is obvious where it will end. And people can't say, I didn't know that was going to happen, because you can say maybe you did know that was going to happen, but you didn't believe it. You didn't believe everybody else was telling you the truth, but you did know. You just think it was true. There's another one for you. How many things do you know that you don't think are true? That's a question that'll keep you up at night. How many lies are you telling yourself only because you want to? Those are the worst ones to get over. It's not the stuff that you figure out that's new. That stuff's exciting. It's the stuff that you were told was wrong, and you defended that it was right, but you knew the other answer. Those are hard ones to get over. So that's another thing about the subjective reality of how the nature of how reality is formed. To wrap this up, then, is it's powered by emotion and given form by logic. And those are two sides of the same coin, which we use to interact with our current snapshot of the world, whatever that might look like, in ways that we think will give us a life that hurts less than it does now, or is less scary than it is now, or is better for our kids than it is now. It's always about seeking some improvement over current status. Whether or not that improvement takes the form of ethical or unethical choices is different for every person. But there's nobody that really starts out in life that says, I just want to fuck shit up. The people that get to the point where they say, I just want to fuck shit up, are the people who have fucked up their life so badly that they realize they're not coming back. And they're honest enough to say, man, I'm proper fucked, is what they say. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, but they reached that decision. Maybe they never had the tools to get it right, or maybe they had choices and they made the wrong ones. Because sometimes people make the wrong choices, and sometimes when the wrong choice gets made, the consequences stick. And so then those people become miserable, and they view their subjective reality as a hell. And the only thing that would be a worse hell for them is to admit that they had a hand in the creation of this hell, and that they also have a hand in the ability to change this hell. They can't handle that. Why? Because then everything that's wrong is linked to them. How bad would that be if things that happened around me were my fault? Well, I have a different question. How bad would it be if all the things that happened around you were outside your ability to change? Well, then what? Then it doesn't matter what you do at all. You have no power, no ability, no influence. And we know that's false because we can learn new things and recognize things that we can learn, which help us change our odds. So that's kind of where that goes. So you really don't have a lot of choices when it comes to, does the universe behave in a way that's inside our ability to control around us or not? Either you do, and then you should learn what to do about it and learn as much as you can as quickly as possible, because you're on a ticking clock and your success isn't guaranteed. Or you can just say, nothing anyone can do about anything, and I'm just going to let the wind take me wherever it will go, and pray that the wind takes you inside the influence of somebody with a bigger picture who doesn't value themselves more than they value your life. Because they will turn you into food for themselves and sell you and buy you for pennies on the dollar. And people have done that literally, and they do that figuratively with their time, their relationships, their business arrangements. And so some of the dandelions fall there, right? Some of them fall there, and their choice is to, I'm just going to let whatever happens, happens. And they fall in a place and they're taken advantage of, and they recognize it, and they never learn how to do any different. So some people live and die there. That's reality. Should that be how it is? No. Will it always be that way? I don't know. Could we examine that problem enough and build a thing around it that becomes part of our cultural memory, very much like running water, where we do engineer a system that outsmarts this and builds it into our behavior? I think it's possible. I think that has to be the goal. And for it to be a goal, people have to believe it's possible, and then they have to use their creativity at the edges of the spectrum to imagine what such a thing would look like, and slowly build to that over time with anything else. Like the quantum computer, we can build a quantum computer. We can do that other thing too. Humans are way simpler than quantum computers when it comes to how they interact with consciousness. A 400 qubit quantum computer can do more calculations than there are particles in the universe. 400. There's only 7 billion people. And guess what? All of the particles that make up every human are on this one planet. So We can do quantum computing. We can figure out a system where people aren't swept into the wind and some of them are swept into the garbage grinder. But until then, you're stuck with the other part of that, which I'll end my other 2 minutes on. You have people who are swept to the wind, and guess what? They land somewhere nice. That's the whole Jesus parable with the seeds on the soil. Some of them go in the good soil and they grow up and they become wheat. That's your good dad, okay? Your dad who gave a shit and did things right. Did you pick that? No. Were you lucky to have one? Yeah. Or maybe a basketball coach who cared about you enough to stay late after practice because you didn't have a ride for 20 minutes. And so he taught you ball handling drills or helped you practice free throws while your mom or dad showed up. That guy, he's luck, all right? Good teacher. People who see how things are enough that they will place themselves strategically to interact with people who are just letting themselves drift with the intention of blowing them somewhere that they know will be good for them. They can't convince them it's the right thing to do. They don't need to. They just need to interact with them in ways that they know will produce reproducible results, which is mostly taking the form of, I'm going to give a shit about you as a human being and be nice to you. And so that is kind of my speech on the nature of how reality is formed. Is we interact with a world that's trying to kill us and we'll eventually get away with it. And it won't be because those meddling kids didn't try their damnedest to stop it. It's just going to happen. Some of us are going to live, some of us are going to die. We all have different tools to work with. We interact with our senses and have information that is stored in our subconscious. Our senses give that information through our gut brain. Our consciousness then tries to make sense of our logic and how we felt about it at the time. And all of those things put together then require some type of validation, meaning it needs to be self-sustaining, self-updating. That's why the validation is relevant too, because the snapshot changes. You have to validate because your information becomes out of date if you don't. You can't look at the world one time and navigate with it forever. So all of those things put together is the nature of how reality is formed. So if, I know I talked right till 4:30, but if you have questions or anything that you want to interject or anything you want to say on camera for future posterity, now would be the time once you're done interacting with your family. Or you can just peace out. That's fine too. But thank you for coming to my TED Talk. What a Russian event similar to the Holocaust? So that was the Stalin type stuff. Stalin killed more people than Hitler did, a lot more. If you disagreed with him politically, they sent you to a forced labor camp, and odds were you died. And if you didn't die, then you wrote a book that was that thick and explained all the horrible people that you saw murdering all of those other people. Yeah, it was bad news, man. It was everything you've read about the concentration camps was happening in Russia. And some of it was worse.
That's definitely something for me to look into.
They don't mention it because Stalin was a communist. And it's unfavorable to speak against things that were associated with communism, or socialist, I'm sorry. Socialism and communism were the two opposing forces in Russia at the time. And I forget which one it was, the socialists were in power. They sent the communists to political prison. Or it's either that or the other way. One of the groups got sent to political prison, but both of those economic models got a bad rap for how many people died when they tried to pursue it. And because it's in vogue right now to talk about socialism and communism, they don't really talk about all the bad history behind it. That's the why of that. You're not going to hear it on the news. They don't teach it in college either for that reason.
I follow.
Anything else, brother?
No, I've been in and out with the kids. I think this is one I'm going to try to rewatch on Friday for sure, to pick the pieces in the middle and ask the extra questions that I didn't ask in the chat
Sure.
There were a few. So I went back to the Stalin one. Something else you said remembered that previous memory. And I'm sure if I watch it again, I'll come up with more too.
Oh, the emotions define reality, logic builds it. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, cool, man. Thanks for watching, and I'll do another one next week.
I'll see you in the dojo.
See you later.